Hello, welcome to Rappler Talk. I'm Merites Vitug, and joining us is Sebastian Strangio, a journalist and author who focuses on Southeast Asia and has been covering the region since 2008. That's more than a decade. And he's also Southeast Asia editor at The Diplomat. And best of all, he just wrote a new book. It was released recently, In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century. Maybe, Sebastian, you can just show it a bit?
Sure. Here it is.
Okay, perfect.
This is the edition that's available in Southeast Asia.
Okay, good. Is that paperback?
This one's paperback, yes.
Okay, good. So at least our viewers, you can order it from Amazon. And you can also order it if you're in the Philippines from one of the bookstores here. So welcome, Sebastian, to Rappler Talk. Thank you very much for making time for this interview.
It's my pleasure.
Yes, first of all, just a bit about you, because I've read the parts of your book and I was intrigued that you chose to be based in Cambodia to cover Southeast Asia. Why is that so, and how was it like? Were you able to get a better perspective of the region?
Well, I initially went to Cambodia to get my start in journalism. One of the remarkable sort of legacies of the UN peacekeeping mission that came to Cambodia in the early 1990s was the fact that it opened up a space for foreign-owned English language media. So it was a place where me and a lot of my Western colleagues were able to go and get a lot of really interesting hands-on experience as journalists. Covering fascinating, the country's fascinating politics, the International War Crimes Tribunal that was getting started at the time, questions about corruption. And authoritarianism. I mean, it really brought us face to face with some of the defining or the most defining questions of the contemporary world. And so I initially started working at the Phnom Penh Post, one of the two English language papers. I didn't really have a particular ambition of covering the region from Cambodia, but because I was already based there and knew the country well and had a lot of affection for it. And the visa, has a very liberal visa policy, so it was an easy place to stay on without too much red tape. I began covering Southeast Asia from there, but it wasn't a plan as such. But Cambodia offered a really interesting perspective on what was happening in Southeast Asia. I mean, as you know, the country's become very close to China, and this was something that we all saw, month by month almost, sort of on the ground in the capital Phnom Penh and around the country. And it, my experience in Cambodia covering this and observing this made me really interested in looking at how a similar sort of dynamic was playing out around the rest of the region.
And you recently wrote in The Diplomat about Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Cambodia. And they signed a free trade agreement. It was really a very cozy relationship. What pushed Cambodia towards China's embrace?
Well, there's two factors one has to take into account. The first factor is that historically, Cambodia has always had an accommodative view of Chinese power. It is not a country that borders China, and therefore Cambodian nationalism doesn't have that strong anti-Chinese charge that, say, Vietnam and even to some extent Myanmar have. Historically, Cambodian leaders and Cambodian nationalists have been most concerned about the two countries to either side, Thailand and particularly Vietnam. If you go to Cambodia and talk to ordinary people about Vietnam, it's always striking the extent to which they fear and suspect Vietnam's intentions in their country. Until relatively recently, the Chinese were viewed in a relatively benign light. That has begun to change with some recent Chinese developments that have been quite disruptive, including, a large, a spate of casinos that have arrived on the southern coast that have begun to create a sort of grassroots anti-Chinese feeling in the country, something that's historically, as I said, quite unusual. So that's the first factor. The second factor is the Western-led attempt to democratize Cambodia, starting in the early 1990s with the UN peacekeeping mission. I think that this sort of attempt to create a model democracy in Cambodia has has in many ways incentivized Prime Minister Hun Sen to move towards a patron, which is to say China, which has deep pockets and doesn't care about how he governs the country. The fact that Cambodia's opposition have been very vocal in trying to harness Western support in their struggles against Hun Sen has also fed into this sort of paranoia about Western, the Prime Minister's paranoia about Western intentions, and incentivized him to embrace China and its no strings approach to aid and development.
Yes. Let's zoom out to Southeast Asia, this region you've been covering and the subject of your recent book. You say that Southeast Asia is really important to China. Why is this region important to China? Also, as well as the US, of course, you can talk also about why this region is being strategically coveted by both US and China.
Well, to understand the importance of Southeast Asia for the Chinese government, you have to try to see Asia from the perspective of Beijing. If you look out from the Chinese capital, you see a very claustrophobic region. Around China's land borders, you have two nuclear-armed powers, Russia and India. You have off its eastern coast a string of US treaty allies, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and of course Taiwan, which is also quite close to the United States. And Chinese strategists have always seen or imagined an American plot to sort of contain China and hem it in. And Southeast Asia looms as the one region in which there is not an incumbent great power. It is a location where the Chinese believe that they can break this chain of encirclement and secure control over their near abroad. Another important consideration, of course, is the economic importance of Southeast Asia. The South China Sea and the Malacca Strait bear a huge percentage of China's exports to world markets, as well as its imports of crude oil from the Middle East. And so, this region is, central to China's future energy security, and hence its broader global ambitions. And so it's no surprise that China has sought to extend its control over the majority of the South China Sea and to begin building up artificial islands and deploying the Coast Guard and the Chinese Navy through these waters. It's also this also adds an extra element of incentive to the question of Taiwan, which of course is a very emotive political issue for the Chinese Communist Party, but is also an important strategic asset as a springboard outward into the Pacific, were it to fall into Chinese hands. Taiwan would also be a huge strategic boon for the Chinese government. And so, for both of these regions, Southeast Asia is a very important region for the achievement of China's wider strategic goals. In many ways, we can say that the road to China's national rejuvenation lies through the mountain passes and island straits of Southeast Asia.
And you mentioned in your book also that like Cambodia is really very close to China. Same with, I think, Laos. But which among the Southeast Asian countries is able to balance its ties between the two powers, US and China? And how do they do it? I mean, how do they do this smart policy?
I think probably the most able have been Singapore and Vietnam. I'll start with Singapore. I mean, the Singaporeans have probably not only some of the most able minds in terms of foreign policy, but they have an institutional stability that ensures a degree of follow through in foreign policy making and strategic thinking. One thing that struck me in the Philippines is that I met some of the most articulate and talented thinkers in the area of foreign policy when I came to the Philippines to research this book. But you do not have in the Philippines a sort of institutional follow through. And so you have someone like President Duterte coming into power and is totally upending Philippine foreign policy. In Singapore, you have this sort of carry through. You also have that in Vietnam, where obviously, neither of these are particularly democratic states. The Singaporean government is a sort of soft authoritarianism, but that allows a certain amount of continuity within the government, given that the People's Action Party has been in control of the country for so long. And the same, is even more true in Vietnam, where the Communist Party, exists in an unchallenged position of control and is able to sort of, one benefit, I suppose, although, I hesitate to use that word, but the one benefit of that is that the Vietnamese Communist Party has been able to sort of set its interests very clearly and follow through on them. So both of these countries have been able to balance robust economic ties with China against sort of, strong ties with other nations. Of the two, I think the Vietnamese have to tread more carefully, given their proximity to China and their heavy reliance on the Chinese economy, as well as simply a history of conflict with China. And so, there's a limit to how far the Vietnamese can go in embracing American power, for instance. But both of those nations have I would say that they've managed probably the best in sort of, meeting the China challenge.
And also recently, U.S. State Secretary Pompeo made a surprise visit to Vietnam and of the other parts of Asia. And you wrote in your diplomat post that he was trying to form an anti-China alliance, which didn't sit well, at least among those countries he visited. So in Southeast Asia, you cannot expect these countries to be an anti-China alliance, right? Because they depend on China for trade, investments.
Right. I mean, it's Southeast Asian nations are fated to live in China's neighborhood. And so, they have to try and get along with China as best they can. Add to that the fact that China has become probably the most important economic partner, or among the most important economic partners of every nation in the region. It is not reasonable to expect Southeast Asian nations to forswear economic relations with China. I think it's also true that, for most Southeast Asian governments, the idea that China is an authoritarian state is not in itself a determinative factor in how they engage with it. I think it is one factor that I think there is some consternation and concern about the way the Chinese government governs, handles its own affairs. But on the whole, Southeast Asian governments, I think, believe they can live with an authoritarian China in a way that, increasing numbers of people in the United States do not. And I think that any American strategy aimed at sort of creating a democratic alliance is going to run into, two problems. One is that there's not a whole lot of nations in Southeast Asia that are actually democratic or liberal. And secondly, even those that have good reasons to maintain close economic relations with China. And they have no particular beef with China outside of, very key areas. But as we've seen with the Philippines and Vietnam and Malaysia, these nations have been able to sort of quarantine South China Sea tensions from their economic relationship with China. Their concerns are situational rather than sort of holistic, I think.
And going to China, do you notice any differences in their diplomacy pre-pandemic and now that the pandemic is still raging in parts of Southeast Asia? Because Wang Yi in his visit sort of did the vaccine diplomacy. We don't judge you, we're your partner. So is this new or a continuing thing, or is this a new pitch that that China is making?
It's a continuation of China's approach to the region, really. I mean, it's all about highlighting the inevitability of engagement and partnership with China, and the inescapability of China in the region. And I mean, really, it's about what I talked about before: geographic proximity and economic dependence. It's about underlining the fact that Southeast Asian nations need China, and China can be an important partner to them. As this is underlined, of course, by the sort of non-interference principle that the Chinese have always made the claim that, unlike Western countries, we will not lecture you. We will not judge how you run your own country. And we will respect your sovereignty. Now, obviously, there's contradictions there as well when we look at what China's done in the maritime domain. But this is, this does hold a genuine appeal in Southeast Asia, as we've seen with President Duterte. I mean, whenever he's come under harsh criticism from the West, he's turned directly to China for support. And we've seen this pattern play out in most parts of the region over the past decade or two. So, I think Wang Yi's visit was really about reinforcing narratives and messages that Chinese diplomats have been bringing to the region for many years.
And the subtitle of your book is Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century. So has the U.S. lost here in Southeast Asia?
Well, I mean, that subtitle, I intended it, to be sort of catchy and to, and so there's nowhere in the book in which I sort of mount a case that this will be the Chinese century. But I think what we can say is that China will be probably, for the remainder of this century, or at least for the foreseeable future, the most prominent and difficult foreign policy challenge that every Southeast Asian nation will have. This is a region in which, considerations about what Beijing's response will be to any particular action will be paramount for most Southeast Asian governments. And I think that, to that extent, yes, this will be sort of a Chinese century. It'll be a century in which the China challenge lies at the center of Southeast Asian nations' foreign policies. But I think that the United States has got a lot of, is entrenched in the region, has been, dealing with it, or trading with it, and investing in it for many decades. It has a strong forward military and naval presence in the region. I don't think that the United States is going anywhere. And I think that, we could discuss, exactly how best, how the US can best engage Southeast Asia, given, the region's desire to maintain good relationships with both superpowers. And I think there's been some, definitely been some missteps under the Trump administration. But, I don't see the United States fading away anytime soon.
So, speaking of the US, Sebastian, of course, this is a very timely interview. The elections, as we speak, we'll be getting results late tonight or maybe in this part of the world tomorrow morning. How will a Biden presidency append Trump's policy towards Southeast Asia and China, or can we see dramatic changes, or what is
I think what we'll see, to put it in a nutshell, we're going to see continuity on the substance and change on the form and implementation. So I think, in terms of American policy toward China, we're not going to witness a reversion back to, the pre-Trump era in terms of views of China. I think a corner has been turned in American perceptions of China that will not be reversed. I think that a Biden administration will continue to view China as a systemic rival, a strategic rival, and will continue to bend American policy towards meeting the challenge posed by China. That also implies that American engagement with Southeast Asia will continue to be framed around, building relationships with an eye toward curbing or containing China's power. I do think we'll see change in the coherence and stability of American policy toward the region. Under Trump, we've seen this, this constant zigzagging between, ideological rhetoric that frames the challenge of China in terms of a global battle between freedom and authoritarianism. And then we see President Trump praising, not only engaging with dictatorial governments and individuals, but actually praising their methods and the way they go about doing things, like praising President Duterte's war on drugs, or cozying up to leaders like Vladimir Putin, Narendra Modi in India, et cetera, et cetera. So we've seen a contradiction in American policy. I think that we'll probably see an amelioration of that contradiction. We'll see the president acting more closely in line with other organs of government. But I still think there'll be a tension in American relations with Southeast Asia. I still think that the American government will frame the competition with China in ideological terms, which is not something that Southeast Asian governments have been very fond of under Trump. And I think there will still be sort of a contradiction there because, of course, as I mentioned earlier, premising your policy on liberal and democratic affinities in a region with not many liberal or democratic states naturally creates some contradictions. And I think that, this will continue to be, a point of friction in America's relationship with Southeast Asian nations. But on the whole, I think we're going to see more coherence, more level-headedness, more investment in diplomacy, and in general, sort of, probably some kind of revived pivot or rebalance policy which will hopefully involve a more robust economic component. Because, of course, the Trump administration has already been quite assertive in terms of defense and security engagements with the region. So, we'll wait and see. I mean, it's going to be a fascinating 24 or 48 hours ahead.
Yes, yes. And also, do you think Southeast Asia will be higher in the radar screen of a Biden administration? I remember during Trump that, he didn't really attend to the summits or really was physically present in ASEAN or East Asia summits. So do you think there will be a change in this?
I think Biden's advisors have said that he will attend ASEAN summits and give the region the sort of attention that they believe it deserves, given its strategic importance. I do think, however, that American policy towards Southeast Asia will overwhelmingly sit downstream of its China policy, and I think that this is something that will continue to be a source of friction with Southeast Asian governments, or a source of, a source of sort of divergent interests, I suppose one would say. It will be a challenge for the U.S. But, I do think that the Trump administration's approach, which has been very episodic, which has made, sweeping declarations of commitment to the region in all of its strategic documents, and then, seeing the administration pick petty trade disputes with nations in the region and skip out on major summits. I think we're going to see that contradictory approach sort of ameliorated to some extent under Biden.
But do you think this was really a cause of irritation with Duterte, or his anger? It was peeved when Obama criticized him for his human rights violations, the war on drugs. Do you think this kind of rhetoric will come also from Biden, the human rights rhetoric?
For certain. I think that, as I said, framing competition with China as sort of in ideological terms, and sort of depicting it as, putting democracy promotion sort of at the center of America's, policy toward meeting China's challenge, I think is pretty hardwired in some ways into the American political consciousness. I mean, America's always framed its power struggles as battles of good versus evil, and I think that will continue to happen under a Biden administration, and there will continue to be frictions when the U.S. government criticizes Southeast Asian nations on questions of human rights and democratic backsliding. This will, and I think this will continue to be something that redounds to China's benefit. That's not to say it should abandon these principles in its engagement with Southeast Asian nations, but I think it has to be more cognizant of the fact that there is a tension between values and interests, and that, and to sort of, I suppose, to sort of pick, to pick its battles, and to choose carefully on which questions it's willing to stand as a matter of principle, and when it can sort of, afford to be a little bit more pragmatic. Because unfortunately, China's rise has meant that the U.S. no longer has the luxury of promoting values and interests simultaneously. The two are increasingly in tension.
One final question, Sebastian, is just to do with the current interest also in the Philippines and other countries, is the vaccine availability of vaccine. And we haven't seen Southeast Asian countries really get together to push for access and distribution through ASEAN. Or do you see anything happening? Because Duterte has said that he prefers vaccine from China in Russia. So do you see anything happening in Southeast Asia that is pushing for having a multilateral effort to access vaccines?
I haven't really seen much on the ASEAN level. It seems like countries have been more comfortable, moving bilaterally to secure access to these vaccines. I think that the bilateral negotiations are generally more nimble. They have quicker results, and I guess when time is of the essence, as during a global pandemic, it may even make sense for nations to be moving on their own accord to secure access to vaccines. But I've so far seen Southeast Asian nations being, very eclectic in the way they're going about securing access to vaccines. And I've actually argued that vaccine diplomacy might actually benefit the region, given its strategic importance and the fact that China and its Western rivals will likely concentrate their efforts, or at least a good portion of their efforts on, in this regard, on Southeast Asia. This ensures, will help ensure that if and when a successful vaccine is isolated and produced, the Southeast Asian nations will be able to gain access to it. And that the nation, whatever nation sort of spearheads the distribution of that vaccine, will hope to gain sort of a strategic benefit from that. So yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at nations like Indonesia, even the Philippines, they've kind of got their fingers in a number of pies in terms of vaccine development, and they've made deals with various countries, which of course reflects the regions or these nations' foreign policies, which is sort of a multi-dimensional hedging, and avoiding an over-reliance on any single power.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. On that hopeful note, we will end the interview. And maybe can you show your book once more,
Sure.
so that those of our viewers who missed it, In the Dragon Shadow, you can order it on Amazon, or you can ask bookstores here in the Philippines. They can order it for you. We hope to continue this conversation in the future as we keep watching China and its influence on Southeast Asia.
I look forward to it. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye.